For 80 years, American power rested on a single promise that it would be everywhere. Sea lanes from the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea, alliances stretching across 3 continents, a global order so pervasive that most people never had to think about who was actually holding it up. That was the deal. Washington paid the price of omnipresence, and in exchange, the world organized itself around American guarantees. That promise sounds different in 2026. Increasingly, the language coming out of Washington is not about defending the world. It's about defending home, the Western Hemisphere, the dollar, a handful of choke points that matter more than the rest combined. Whether this is a genuine strategic pivot or simply the rhetoric of a moment, something has clearly shifted in how American power talks about itself. And here is what makes this moment dangerous. Russia is not behaving like a country that believes the old guarantees still hold. After years of grinding war, conventional wisdom says Moscow should be exhausted, cautious, retreating. But look closer, and retreat is not what's happening. Russia is repositioning economically, diplomatically, militarily, as though it senses room to maneuver that wasn't there before. Which raises the only question that actually matters here. If Washington truly has traded global guarantees for a narrower, harder-edged strategy of self-interest, what happens the moment Russia decides to test it? What does America first mean when translated into military doctrine? Why has so much of the world quietly decided the Ukraine war is settled? And what does Moscow do next if it suspects nobody is watching as closely as they used to? Before we can answer any of that, we need to understand exactly what has changed in Washington's thinking. And, just as importantly, what hasn't. Start with what can actually be observed without interpretation. The Ukraine war, once defined by rapid territorial swings and grinding offensives, has settled into something quieter. Front lines have stabilized. Major offensive operations from either side have slowed to a level that most analysts now describe, cautiously, as a frozen or semi-frozen conflict. That doesn't mean peace. It means the war has stopped changing shape as quickly as it once did. At the same time, something has shifted in Washington's own language. Statements from the executive branch and the Pentagon over the past year have leaned more heavily toward hemispheric concerns, securing trade routes through Latin America, watching Chinese investment expand across the region, and paying close attention to Venezuela specifically. This is not a formal declaration that global commitments are ending, but the emphasis, documented across public statements and budget priorities, has measurably moved closer to home. Meanwhile, a separate and unresolved pressure point sits in the Middle East. Tensions involving Iran remain active enough to threaten energy markets and alliance politics at any moment, independent of whatever happens in Ukraine or Latin America. It is its own variable, not a subplot. 4 actors matter most as this story unfolds. The United States, whose executive branch and military posture are visibly recalibrating. Russia, whose Kremlin leadership and military command are making decisions shaped by everything happening around them. China, positioned as an interested third party, carefully managing its relationships with both Washington and Moscow without fully committing to either. And the European members of NATO, increasingly asked, sometimes bluntly, to fund and staff more of their own continental defense than in decades past. None of this, on its own, tells us why any of it is happening. That interpretation comes later. For now, these are simply the facts on the table. A stabilized war, a rhetorical shift toward hemispheric priorities, an unresolved Middle East, and 4 major actors recalculating their positions in real time. On paper, this looks like a world settling down, but settling down and standing down are not the same thing. And to understand why Washington might be rethinking its role now, we have to go back further than this administration, to the doctrine that built American power in the first place. To understand why Washington's priorities might be shifting now, we need to go back to 1971, the year the United States severed the dollar's link to gold. That decision solved one problem and created another. Without gold backing, the dollar needed a new anchor to remain the currency the world trusted and used. The answer came through an arrangement with Saudi Arabia. Oil, priced in dollars, sold globally, with American security guarantees extended across the Middle East in return. The petrodollar system was born, and with it, an obligation. If the dollar's strength depended on oil flowing in dollars, then American power now depended on keeping those oil routes and the region producing them secure. This was not a side commitment. It became structural. That obligation didn't exist in isolation. It echoed a much older strategic idea, formulated over a century ago by the British geographer Mackinder: whoever controls the Eurasian landmass, the Heartland, controls the world. Mackinder's insight shaped how maritime powers like Britain, and later the United States, actually behaved. Neither tried to physically occupy Eurasia. Instead, both pursued a subtler strategy: prevent any single power from unifying that landmass under one authority. Fund resistance, balance rivals against each other. Keep the heartland fractured, because a fractured heartland cannot challenge a maritime power's global reach. Trace that logic forward, and the pattern holds. NATO's expansion eastward after the Cold War was, among other things, a continuation of this same instinct, keeping Eurasia divided rather than letting any power, including a resurgent Russia, consolidate influence across it. That expansion, and the tensions it accumulated over 3 decades, forms much of the backdrop to Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, a war that, whatever else it represents, sits squarely within this century-old contest over the Eurasian heartland. But guaranteeing security across the Middle East for the petrodollar, while simultaneously containing Eurasia through NATO, while also managing a rising China in the Indo-Pacific, is an enormous simultaneous burden. 3 theaters, 1 guarantor. And the costs, measured in dollars spent, political capital exhausted, and the patience of a domestic public increasingly skeptical of open-ended commitments abroad, accumulate whether or not any single crisis makes headlines. None of this is a new dilemma, even if it feels urgent today. Dominant powers have faced this exact fork before. Imperial Britain wrestled with the cost of defending a global empire it could no longer sustain indefinitely. Further back, some historians draw the same comparison to Rome, stretched thin across frontiers it could not simultaneously hold. These are analogies, not prophecies. History doesn't repeat with precision, but it does rhyme, and it rarely resolves the way the empire in question expects. With that history in view, we can now examine the actual argument being made about America's new strategy today, and why it turns out to be far more contested than it first appears. This is where the story stops being descriptive and becomes contested, so it's worth being precise about what follows. What you're about to hear is an interpretation, popularized by online commentators including Jiang, not a confirmed statement of U.S. policy. No administration has issued a document declaring this strategy by name. But the argument itself deserves to be taken seriously, because it offers a coherent explanation for the patterns we've already established. The thesis goes like this: facing federal debt in the trillions, a manufacturing base hollowed out by decades of offshoring, and diminishing strategic returns from guaranteeing security everywhere at once, the United States is allegedly narrowing its ambitions. Rather than policing the entire globe, the argument suggests, Washington is consolidating around a smaller set of high-value assets: the dollar system itself, a handful of critical maritime corridors, and the Western Hemisphere, reframed under an expanded Monroe Doctrine logic that some commentators have nicknamed a Trump corridor. Under this reading, the growing attention paid to Venezuela and Latin American trade routes isn't really about any single country. It's about denying rivals, China chief among them, a deeper foothold in America's own backyard, while global commitments elsewhere are quietly reduced. It's a tidy theory. It's also far from settled. Many mainstream analysts push back hard, and their case deserves equal weight here. NATO's Article 5 commitments remain formally intact. American forces remain deployed across the Middle East. Indo-Pacific alliances with Japan, South Korea, and Australia show no sign of official abandonment. From this vantage point, the retrenchment narrative is built from a handful of statements and a few regional deployments, stretched into a grand theory that the evidence doesn't fully support. Continuity, these analysts argue, is still the dominant reality, not rupture. So which is it? Here's the uncomfortable truth. For the purposes of what happens next, the answer may not matter as much as you'd think, because the actor whose judgment actually shapes the next move isn't a think tank in Washington, it's the Kremlin. If Russian leadership believes, even partially, that American appetite for underwriting every regional conflict is softening, that belief alone changes incentives, regardless of whether it's objectively true. A Russia that senses genuine strategic space behaves differently than a Russia convinced the old guarantees are fully intact. That's the mechanism worth watching. Consider the military dimension first. Reduced U.S. forward posture in any given theater doesn't need to be dramatic to matter. Even a perceived softening, Fewer reassurance deployments, quieter rhetoric from Washington toward European allies can embolden a Kremlin already inclined to test boundaries incrementally rather than through outright confrontation. Then there's the economic dimension, where the picture is murkier but arguably more consequential. Years of sanctions have produced real fatigue, both in Moscow and among the Western governments enforcing them. Simultaneously, deepening trade coordination between Russia, Iran, and China, settling transactions outside the dollar system, building alternative payment channels, represents a slow, unglamorous erosion of exactly the choke point leverage the retrenchment thesis assumes America is trying to protect. If that leverage weakens gradually enough, no single crisis needs to occur for the strategic balance to shift. Diplomatically, the more revealing signals aren't found in direct confrontation, but at the margins. Watch how Russia tests NATO cohesion, hybrid pressure on the Baltic states, energy leverage over vulnerable European economies, calculated ambiguity around Ukraine's frozen front lines. None of it declares war. All of it probes for cracks. And underneath all of this sits a quieter contest of perception, closer to intelligence work than public diplomacy. Both Washington and Moscow are, in effect, gaming out the other's true threshold. How far can Russia push before American guarantees, however diminished in rhetoric, reassert themselves in practice? How far can the U.S. narrow its commitments before an emboldened rival forces its hand regardless? This is the real contrast worth holding on to. The public narrative on both sides still describes steady alliances and clear red lines. The strategic reality, visible to anyone tracking deployments, trade flows, and diplomatic signaling closely, looks more like stretched resources and quietly shifting calculations. Neither side is likely to announce which version is true. Russia's next move will answer the question for them. And that's precisely why this isn't a regional story confined to Eastern Europe. Its consequences reach much further than the front lines currently suggest. Start regionally, because that's where the pressure will show first. If Russia genuinely believes Washington's appetite for confrontation has narrowed, the most likely response isn't a renewed offensive in Ukraine. It's something quieter and harder to counter. Deeper gray zone activity, hybrid pressure campaigns against vulnerable NATO members, energy leverage reasserted over European economies still recovering from previous supply shocks, closer coordination with Iran, extending Russian influence into a second theater without ever crossing a line that demands direct American response. None of it announces itself as escalation. All of it changes the board. But the real significance of this moment isn't regional at all. It's the signal it sends to every other power currently deciding how much to trust American guarantees. China is watching closely, not just for what happens in Ukraine, but for how seriously Washington treats European security while simultaneously courting its own high-stakes bargain with Beijing. Gulf states long hedging between American security guarantees and growing economic ties to China and Russia will read Washington's response as a data point in their own recalculations. And quieter allies like Japan and South Korea, whose security still depends heavily on American commitment, are almost certainly asking a version of the same question privately. If a crisis erupted closer to home, would the guarantees hold, or would this become the precedent? There are winners and losers under each possible reading, and it's worth being even-handed about both. A disciplined, genuinely executed retrenchment could stabilize American finances, reduce the strain of simultaneous global commitments, and correct decades of overextension, but likely at real cost to alliance trust built over generations. A poorly managed retrenchment, by contrast, risks the opposite outcome entirely, emboldening multiple rivals at once, each testing limits independently, while placing new strain on the very dollar system this strategy is supposedly designed to protect. Discipline and disorder produce very different worlds from the same starting point. The economic ripple effects are already visible in outline, if not yet in full. Energy markets remain sensitive to any shift in Middle Eastern stability or Russian supply behavior. Defense spending debates are intensifying across both Europe and Asia as allies quietly hedge against reduced American burden sharing. And the dollar system itself, still the backbone of global trade, faces slow pressure from exactly the kind of alternative arrangements Russia, Iran, and China have been building. Politically, this plays out domestically within the United States as much as abroad. The debate over the cost and purpose of global leadership, long simmering beneath the surface of American politics, is no longer abstract. It has real consequences attached to it now, visible in budgets, deployments, and rhetoric. This is the contrast that matters most. Tactical restraint, in the short term, can look like prudent discipline, but repeated often enough in enough theaters, that same restraint risks becoming something else entirely, a steady erosion of the credibility that alliances are built on. Every ally and every rival is taking notes on how this plays out. Which brings us to the only question left unanswered. What does Russia actually do next? And how does Washington respond? None of what follows should be mistaken for prediction. These are scenarios built from the incentives and pressures already outlined, plausible paths, not forecasts of certainty. Treat them as a map of possibilities, not a script Russia is guaranteed to follow. The first path is patient consolidation. Here, the frozen conflict in Ukraine stays frozen. Russia uses the pause not to prepare a new offensive, but to rebuild economic and military capacity strained by years of war, while probing NATO cohesion through non-military means. Energy pressure, disinformation, political influence in vulnerable member states. The risk to the West is complacency, mistaking stillness for resolution. The opportunity is time, a genuine window to reinforce alliance commitments before any harder test arrives. Washington and Brussels would likely respond with continued, if uneven, reassurance measures along NATO's eastern flank. The second path is a controlled test. Rather than reigniting Ukraine directly, Russia probes through a secondary domain, an energy infrastructure incident, a cyber operation, a proxy flashpoint calibrated to stay below the threshold that would demand direct confrontation. The risk here is escalation through miscalculated response, where either side reads the other's reaction more aggressively than intended. The opportunity, paradoxically, is clarity. A controlled test would reveal, more honestly than any speech, how firm American guarantees actually remain. Expect Washington to respond cautiously, weighing deterrence signaling against the danger of overreaction, while Beijing watches from a careful distance. The third path is slower, and in some ways more consequential than either. Deepening economic coordination between Russia, Iran, and China. Gradually eroding dollar-based trade and the choke point leverage the retrenchment strategy depends on. No single dramatic event marks this path. Instead, the erosion accumulates quietly. Alternative payment systems, energy deals settled outside dollar channels, incremental steps that individually seem minor but collectively weaken American leverage over time. The risk is that this path is the hardest to counter precisely because it offers no clear moment to respond to. The opportunity for Washington lies in recognizing the trend early enough to adapt policy before the leverage is meaningfully gone. The fourth path is the least likely and the most dangerous: miscalculation. Either side overestimates how much room it has to maneuver. Russia misjudging the durability of American restraint, or Washington misjudging how far a narrower strategy can stretch before a rival forces its hand. Historically, this is how regional tensions become something far larger than either side intended. The probability is low. The consequences, if it occurred, would not be. Across all four paths, weigh the same variables: what each side risks, what each side stands to gain, and how Washington, Brussels, and Beijing are likely to calibrate their responses in real time, often with incomplete information about the other's true intentions. Notice something these four paths share. None of them require a single dramatic headline to unfold. That is exactly what makes this test so difficult to see coming in real time, and once underway, so difficult to call off. Whichever path actually unfolds, it brings us back to the question this entire video started with. We began with a paradox, and it's worth sitting with it one final time. A superpower built for 80 years on the promise of being everywhere is now experimenting with the discipline of being somewhere. Narrower, more selective, more deliberate about where it spends its strength. That experiment is not inherently a mistake, but it has never been tested against a rival actively probing its edges until now. And that is the deeper lesson underneath everything we've covered. Grand strategies are not proven by the intentions behind them. They are proven by how they hold up under pressure from someone willing to push against their limits. Intentions are cheap. Performance under pressure is not. It's also worth being honest about the limits of this analysis itself. Anyone offering total certainty about how this resolves, confident predictions of collapse, of war, of triumph, is offering narrative, not forecasting. The honest position is less satisfying but more accurate. Multiple outcomes remain genuinely plausible, and no single analyst, however compelling their framework, can collapse that uncertainty into a guarantee. What we can say is this: the coming months will reveal more about the true shape of American strategy through Russian behavior than through any speech delivered in Washington. Strategy, in the end, is defined at the edges, by rivals testing how much of it is real. The real answer to whether this new approach actually works won't come from a think tank, a policy paper, or a press briefing. It will come from whatever Moscow decides to do next. And by the time that answer is clear enough to prove the theory right or wrong, the world it's tested against may already look very different. So the question worth carrying forward isn't whether this strategy sounds coherent. It's whether it survives contact with a rival that has every incentive to find out.